September 23rd, 1950. Seoul still slept under a pale gray sky, but the city no longer felt alive. You could smell ash before you could see it. A thin, acrid mist drifted between the empty Japanese-era boulevards, mixing with burned rubber, wet stone, and exhaust from vehicles that were long gone. The artillery rumbled in the distance, not close enough to be terrifying, but close enough to remind the city that it was no longer safe. In the basement of the former Government General Building, now the North Korean Army's local headquarters, several senior officers stood around a map table. Their uniforms were pressed, their boots polished, but their faces had thinned. Their eyes had lost the shine of early victory. They didn't speak much anymore, not like they had in June. No one said reunification now. No one said victory is certain. Back then, the war had felt like a fast train heading south, unstoppable, inevitable. Now, it felt more like a slow breakdown, a warning, a delay before something worse. Colonel Peng Rim had been photographed leading T-34 tanks into Seoul 3 months earlier. The image of him standing in his hatch, red flag fluttering, had been reprinted everywhere, from Pyongyang to Beijing to Moscow. He had believed it too, believed the myth, believed the newspapers, believed the slogans, believed that the United States would never fight a real ground war in Asia, that its soldiers were too soft, too hesitant, too far from home, that its equipment was too heavy, too slow, too unrealistic for Korean terrain. He had repeated the Soviet advisor's favorite line, "Americans don't bleed for Asia." Now he stood in that basement and watched a radio operator tremble. The young lieutenant listened through his headphones, scribbling fragments of intercepted English. He looked up, hesitant, as if speaking would make it true. Pyeng watched him. No one else in the room moved. Finally, the signal officer read what he had written. Confirmed. Armored column advancing past Mapo Bridge. Civilian presence minimal. Resistance light. Estimated time to city center, 2 hours. No one reacted. No one knew how to. They didn't even fully understand. Because that message wasn't just reporting enemy movement. It was reporting enemy presence. Inside the city, inside Seoul. Inside the capital they were still claiming to control. Colonel Pyeng stared. Slowly, he spoke. That isn't possible. He didn't ask. He stated it like a fact. They don't have tanks at Inchon? Because that was the assumption, the logic, the military truth. Inchon had shallow mudflats. Inchon had a 12-meter tide difference. Inchon could not be used to land heavy armor. That was what Soviet naval experts had said. That was what North Korean intelligence had confirmed. That was what every officer believed. And now it was wrong. 3 days earlier, on September 20th, the first American tank, an M-26 Pershing, had rolled off a landing ship near Inchon. The escorts had followed. Shermans, half-tracks, engineers, trucks, artillery. None of it should have been possible, but it was. Those tanks were not static. They were moving, and they were headed to Seoul. In the command room, General Cho Yong-gon said nothing. He didn't ask for confirmation. He didn't question the report. He just looked at the map. Because there it was, in black and blue pencil, a line, a path, a direction, from Inchon, along Highway 1, across the Han River, and into Seoul, the invasion route none of them had defended, the road they hadn't even thought about. Outside, artillery echoed again, closer now. The windows rattled. A portrait of Kim Il-sung on the far wall flickered under a single dim bulb. His expression hadn't changed, but the belief behind it had. Somewhere above ground, Civilians could hear tanks, not artillery, tanks. The difference was simple. Artillery thudded, tanks growled, they clattered, they scraped metal against asphalt. And that morning, Seoul heard that sound for the first time. To understand how shocking that was, you have to understand how North Korea viewed the war in June. They believed it was already won. When North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, they expected victory in weeks. They were organized, Soviet-trained, heavily armed, and highly mobile. Their T-34 tanks were battle-proven in World War II. The South Korean military had no tanks, almost no artillery, and almost no anti-armor capability. Seoul fell in 3 days. Busan seemed next. North Korean propaganda declared the Americans weak, unprepared, unwilling. A Soviet advisor even said, "We are watching the collapse of the American army in real time." But what none of them understood was simple. America had not yet truly entered the war. It was reacting, not fighting, not yet. General Douglas MacArthur had a plan no one believed he would dare attempt, a landing behind enemy lines, a counterstrike not in the south, but on the west coast, not where the North Korean army was strongest, but where it was weakest, and the landing point would be Inchon. North Korean intelligence concluded it was impossible. There were no defenses there, no minefields, no anti-tank barriers. A few undertrained troops watched the shoreline. No tanks, no concrete bunkers, just mud, tide, and confidence. But MacArthur had one advantage that Seoul lacked: audacity. And on September 15, 1950, at 0630 hours, U.S. Marines stepped onto the mud of Inchon, and they didn't stop. They took Wol-mi-do. They captured the port, and then, impossibly, they unloaded armor. Not light armor, heavy armor, Pershings, Pattons, Shermans, tanks. North Korea had never faced tanks built to kill Soviet tanks. Soviet advisors in Pyongyang didn't even believe the early reports. One commented, "This is disinformation. Americans cannot land armor on that coast." By September 19th, they believed it. By September 21st, they were nervous. By September 23rd, they were gone, because that was the day the Soviet advisors quietly left Seoul. At dawn on the 23rd, 2 trucks arrived at Kim Chek's field headquarters north of the city. They were not full of reinforcements. They were carrying files, radios, and personnel back to Pyongyang. The message from Moscow was clear: advise, but don't be captured. Help, but don't be responsible. It was the first real sign that this war was changing. In Seoul, Colonel Pying still looked at the map. Artillery boomed once more. Closer now, much closer. He finally spoke almost to himself. "We didn't defend Inchon because we didn't believe anyone could land there." Then he looked at General Cho. "We believed they wouldn't try because we believed they wouldn't risk it." General Cho stared at the door, listening to the faint rumble of approaching armor. "They did," he said quietly. "They risked everything." That morning, no one spoke of victory, not anymore, because for the first time in this war, North Korea did not know how much they were losing, but they knew they were. September 25, 1950. Dawn did not rise over Seoul in light, but in smoke. A dull gray haze clung to the rooftops, mixed with the sour smell of burned rubber and spent gunpowder. You didn't need binoculars to know something was coming. You could feel it in the tremor of the glass panes, in the metallic hum beneath the pavement, in the uneasy silence of a city holding its breath. At first, people thought it was artillery, but artillery thuds. This sound growled, deep mechanical, unhurried, and confident. Tanks. In the underground bunker beneath the former government general building, Colonel Pyeng Rim heard the sound before he believed it. American tanks had crossed the Han River sometime before dawn, not approaching Seoul. Inside Seoul, inside the city, they still officially controlled. A young radio operator, his voice cracking, repeated the intercepted message. Red Dog 1 to Red Dog Actual. Armored column entering urban grid. Civilians non-hostile. Objective, Gwanghwamun Gate. The room fell silent, not because they didn't believe it, but because they suddenly did. Colonel Pyeng had been one of the first men to drive into Seoul back in June under a bright red flag. He remembered the cheering, the adrenaline, the belief that this war was already won. And now, 3 months later, American tanks were on those same streets, and no one was celebrating. Above ground, the first M-26 Pershing tank pushed across Mapo Bridge at 7:40 a.m. Its treads scraped the asphalt with a grinding roar, followed by 2 M4 Shermans. Civilians peeked carefully from doorways. Some ran and hid. Others didn't. They simply watched. A South Korean woman reportedly whispered to her son, "They've come back." She didn't say who. She didn't need to. In military terms, Seoul had not fallen yet. But the moment citizens began pointing directions to American tank crews, it had. They guided them not to bunkers, not to barricades, not to machine gun nests, but to City Hall, to the Central Post Office, to the Palace Gate. Not tactical targets, symbolic ones. War is not only about territory, it is about meaning. What was happening in Seoul was not just military, it was psychological. At 9:15 a.m., from a captured North Korean radio station, an American voice crackled through, calm and matter-of-fact. Seoul is open city. Repeat, Seoul is open city. Resistance minimal. Civilians cooperative. North Korean officers listened in their bunker. No one bothered to dispute it. They had always assumed that when the Americans eventually landed, it would be at Busan, or maybe at Wonsan, or they would just bomb from the air and avoid ground combat. No one imagined they would bypass the entire front, land at Inchon, move armor through tidal mud, cross a defended river, and reach Seoul in 10 days. Because they weren't tracking the tanks. They were tracking their own beliefs. At 10:20 a.m., an officer burst into the command post, mud on his boots, fear in his voice. "They're in Gwanghwamun Square. Sir, they're photographing the tanks in front of the palace gates." The room didn't erupt in shouting. It just went quiet, a different kind of silence. One officer finally said, "We didn't lose Seoul today. We lost it the day we believed they couldn't take it." That sentence would never be recorded in any official document, but it may have been the truest thing said in that war. In the early afternoon, the first outdoor crowds formed around American armored convoys. No cheering, no flags, just watching. Some stood still, hands folded, exhausted by months of fear. Others bowed slightly, not in celebration, but in relief. A shopkeeper near Yongno reportedly whispered, "Maybe we can start over." The soldiers in the American tanks didn't fully understand the moment. They saw civilians, yes, but not just civilians, witnesses. People witnessing defeat, not through surrender ceremonies or speeches, but through motion, through the sound of enemy tanks rolling past symbols of victory that had lasted only 3 months. Inside the bunker, the order finally came. Withdraw. That word hung in the air like smoke. No final stand. No glorious last defense. No heroic speech. Just burn documents. Destroy radios. Leave the city before nightfall. Leave behind guns, uniforms, even some wounded. Leave everything except the lesson. General Cho wrote in his field journal, not as an order, not as strategy, just as a human observation. War moves faster than belief. It would be found years later in a warehouse in Pyongyang, water-stained and barely legible. Before leaving, Colonel Peng Rim looked one last time at the maps on the wall. The same maps used to plan the invasion. The maps still had red arrows sweeping south, crossing the Nakdong River, trapping Americans near Busan. That future never existed, and now it never would. He reached out and pulled the map down. It tore along the center. Outside, American armor was no longer approaching. It was already parked at the palace gates. Night fell without ceremony. No final broadcast, no triumphant speeches, no promises of glorious resistance. The city simply dimmed, slowly, as if the war had already passed by and was now moving somewhere else. Fires still burned in the industrial districts, but no one rushed to put them out. Except for a few scattered radio transmissions, Seoul had gone quiet. Not the strategic quiet of armies preparing to fight, but the empty quiet of armies that had already begun to leave. At the North Korean command post, the officers packed quickly, but not in panic. Panic is noisy. Panic is frantic. This was something colder. Some gathered documents, others smashed radios with rifle butts, and others poured fuel over wooden crates filled with propaganda leaflets showing triumphant T-34s entering Seoul 3 months earlier. A young officer tried to fold the red flag properly before tucking it away. His commander told him to leave it behind. He didn't argue. Colonel Peng Rim stood in the nearly empty bunker, holding a field phone in his hand, a phone that no longer worked, even though the line was technically still connected. There was no one left to call, not in Seoul, not in Pyongyang, not in Suwon or Anyang or Inchon. Not because the phones were dead, but because the belief was dead. Command still existed on paper, but paper no longer mattered. The information on those maps had been correct. The numbers were correct. The supply estimates were correct. But one thing had never been correct: the assumption that military superiority could be measured only in artillery and tanks, and not in adaptation, psychology, timing, or unpredictability. The Americans didn't just win on the battlefield, Peng said quietly to General Choi. They changed the battlefield. He didn't say it like a complaint or an excuse. He said it like a man who had finally seen something clearly. By midnight, the first North Korean convoys began moving north toward Kaesong and Pyongyang, on foot, on bicycles, on trucks running without headlights, using side roads and riverbeds, not because they had been routed by force, but because they no longer held ground that could be defended, not militarily, not politically, not symbolically. Seoul wasn't just a location, it was a statement. And that statement had changed. Retreat wasn't announced, it simply happened. A sergeant at the communications table wrote the last transmission sent from Seoul. "We are repositioning." He didn't bother specifying where. In the following days, fragments of the North Korean army fought delaying actions north of Seoul, but morale had cracked. They still had men. They still had tanks. They still had Soviet advisors, though fewer now, but they no longer had confidence, and confidence is what makes an army believe that retreat is temporary. Without it, retreat becomes exile. Back in Seoul, American troops advanced through central avenues once used by North Korean victory parades. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Military police directed tanks past clusters of silent civilians. Children watched from behind rubble walls. For the second time in 4 months, the flags over City Hall changed. In June, it had taken hours. In September, it took minutes. One North Korean captain, captured near Dongdaemun Gate, was asked by an American intelligence officer when his unit had first realized Seoul was lost. He didn't mention Inchon. He didn't mention tanks or MacArthur's Landing or broken supply lines. He said, "When the people stopped hiding from you." It was a startling moment of clarity. Wars can be understood before they are won and lost, before anyone surrenders. Some battles are decided by supply, some by terrain, some by firepower. The official explanation was temporary setback due to imperialist air power. But among officers, a different explanation circulated quietly, privately, never spoken near microphones. We didn't lose because they were stronger. We lost because they were unpredictable. The fall of Seoul did more than reverse the war. It rewrote the war. It forced North Korea to abandon the dream of rapid reunification and forced the United States to confront the reality that it could and would fight and bleed for Asia. It pushed China into the conflict. It made the Soviet Union silently reconsider American resolve, and it turned the Korean War from a local civil war into the first true proxy war of the Cold War era. Strategically, Inchon and Seoul taught a lesson that echoed far beyond the Korean peninsula. Fixed assumptions are more dangerous than moving tanks. Most armies lose battles, not when they run out of bullets, but when they run out of imagination. Years later, when asked what had gone wrong, in September 1950, a former North Korean staff officer, now an aging general, reportedly said, "We did not understand that wars can move in directions that maps don't show." And then, after a long silence, he added, "We believed the Americans would not dare to land at Inchon. That was our defense. Pause, and that was our defeat."